Okay, welcome everyone to our Modern History Research Centre seminar. I'm delighted to introduce Dr Anna Maguire from UCL. Anna is a lecturer in public history, a historian of migration, war and empire in 20th century Britain and the British Empire. She's currently working on a history of sanctuary for refugees in Britain 1950 to 2000. And she is also involved in history education and collaborative public history projects, and I think you've worked with the Imperial War Museum, which we just visited recently with our students. In 2019, with Daya Gupta, she ran the Teaching Empire and War project, running workshops with local schools and producing a free online learning resource. She has published numerous articles in such journals as History Workshop Journal, American Historical Review, and New Formations, a journal of culture, theory and politics. Anna has published a monograph with the title Contact Zones of the First World War, Cultural Encounters Across the British Empire, published by Cambridge University Press in 2021, and edited a book, Colonial Encounters in a Time of Global Conflict, published by Routledge in 2021. And her talk today clearly reflects her current research. So a warm welcome, Anna. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you everyone for coming on what feels like the first spring evening of the year. So I really appreciate you giving up an hour or so to listen to me talk and to hear from our colleagues. Hopefully you can see that all right on the screen. Does it look okay, Emily?
Yes.
Yeah, perfect. Okay, so my talk, as Chris has indicated, is picking up on my new research and thinking about this idea of sanctuary as a British tradition, as a way of exploring the experience and resettlement of refugees in the UK from 1951 to 2000. The claim of a particularly British tradition of providing sanctuary to refugees is one that has been readily seized upon by politicians in recent years. In the summer of 2021, then Foreign Secretary Dominic Raab insisted that the government wanted to demonstrate that Britain was a big-hearted nation as he announced the Afghan Citizens Resettlement Scheme to welcome 20,000 people who were forced to leave Afghanistan to the UK over 5 years. In December 2022, The Independent revealed that while the scheme had granted indefinite leave to remain to 6,000 refugees already in the UK, only 4 people who had fled Afghanistan after the Taliban's takeover had been resettled. Those Afghan refugees in the country have repeatedly called for family reunification for those left behind and for permanent housing solutions rather than temporary accommodation in hotels. Elsewhere, Raab, who then became Justice Secretary and Deputy Prime Minister before his resignation last April, he proposed a new Bill of Rights. This followed his critique of the European Court of Human Rights prevention of the forcible removal of asylum seekers to Rwanda. The logic at play in the current Conservative government's policies towards refugees and asylum seekers is the preservation of the sanctuary of the nation by limiting its access to a very few who deserve it, and if the Rwanda plans continue as they seem to be heading, removing those less deserving beyond the borders. Protecting the sanctity of sanctuary through border control is an idea expressed by previous politicians and leaders, including Margaret Thatcher and by Tony Blair under New Labour, particularly in Jack Straw's time as Home Secretary. For others, maintaining the tradition of sanctuary has meant campaigning for its extension into the present. Labour peer Alf Dubs has frequently called upon his personal experience of Britain's historic sanctuary during the Kindertransport to fight for further protections for child refugees, including those taken from other Home Office-run hotels for asylum seekers. So whether it is the language of big-heartedness or generosity or hospitality, the ideal of sanctuary has been a political tool to leverage for further support for refugees and asylum seekers or to limit its delivery. Though often these terms are used interchangeably, sanctuary particularly has a historical resonance which roots this tradition in the very distant past, offering the weight of past successes to those seeking to prove Britain has already done its part, or as precedent to welcome further arrivals. The Reverend Percy Innocen, a field worker with the Ecumenical Committee of the British Council of Churches, reflected on this history as part of a campaign for welcoming refugees in the immediate years after the Second World War. And it's the quote on the screen. Over and over again in our island story, persecuted people have taken sanctuary here and have, in the course of time, enriched our national life and character, as well as giving new direction to our industries. If we can absorb this new life that has come into our midst, it may mean a revitalizing of our common life in many ways. Throughout its invocation then, sanctuary has been called upon as a place. Partly this is due to the inheritance of religious spaces as sanctuaries, as continued to happen in contemporary Britain, but it's also been through defining what the nation of Britain has meant. Defining the space of a state as a sanctuary with its borders and boundaries suggests that sanctuary ends at access. So if sanctuary is a space, and in this case, a nation, to which refugees are bestowed entry, then it is relatively easy to challenge the idea of a sanctuary tradition in Britain. I know this is something Emily has been considering in her work on Britain's Smith of Hospitality, thinking about museums about the Holocaust and migration. But even in prime examples like the Kindertransport, which are often used to solidify this tradition, as in Alf Dubb's campaigning work, the limits of what the state has been able to offer are evident. Recent historiographical work has demonstrated the extent to which a consistent vision of sanctuary, defined and purported by the state, cannot be sustained. And I'm thinking of Peter Gattrell's investigation into World Refugee Year in 1959, which revealed the British government's willingness to send humanitarian aid abroad rather than bring refugees in. Becky Taylor's recent groundbreaking study of refugees in the 20th century begins with the need for sanctuary to be qualified. And in work by Amy Grant on anti-deportation campaigns using the concept of bureaucratic violence, and myself in considering refugee policy as a tool of isolation, we've expanded the work of historians of migration to demonstrate the exertion of power and control by the state towards refugees and asylum seekers, so the beginnings of a hostile environment before it was explicit policy. As has been fulsomely demonstrated by historians of empire, the idea of adopting a balance sheet approach to Britain as a sanctuary, weighing occasions of welcome against deterrence or prevention, has limited analytic power. Destabilising the tradition of Britain as a place of sanctuary only takes us so far in understanding why the UK's response to refugees and asylum seekers has changed, and who has been involved in this change within and beyond the state. Instead, thinking about sanctuary as a process rather than a fixed space of the nation, as something that is made and done rather than something which exists and to which entry can be bestowed, enables us to acknowledge the wide range of experiences of refugees in Britain and the diverse impulses to help refugees. Sanctuary as a project recognises the multiplicity of approaches by a range of stakeholders who have had varying ideological impulses motivating their involvement with refugees, as well as those who were drawn into this process by virtue of their work elsewhere. By attending to processes like befriending, fostering solidarity, or bordering, we reveal the importance of charities, NGOs, and the voluntary sector, of activists and campaigners, and of refugees themselves to any notion of sanctuary. So this attention to the process enables a centering of the voice of the refugee as key agents in the sanctuary project, rather than the passive recipients of Britain's benevolence. It takes this tradition out of the hands of the state and instead insists on its construction from below and within the third sector. Integrating this process of sanctuary into modern Britain speaks to the broader history of migration, decolonisation, race relations, and the state, as well as humanitarianism. This begins with the very categorisation by which refugees were sorted and distinguished from other migrants or mobile peoples, particularly through entangled legacies of empire, and increasingly on the terms of their genuineness. It also speaks to a bigger question about what the nation meant in this period. The treatment of distant strangers, as they might have been viewed through the lens of humanitarian aid workers when they moved in next door, is indicative of what were understood to be Britain's responsibilities, and how the nation and Britishness would be made available to others. So, what I want to do through the remainder of my time today is to think about 3 examples of the process of sanctuary as they are manifesting in my research across Britain in the second half of the 20th century. I'm going to start with hospitality in the 1950s, before moving on forward to multicultural belonging in the 1980s, and finally resistance through the campaign against Fortress Europe in the 1990s. Though in each case, the problem being helped through these processes is different, they are interrelated. The first is thinking about the navigation of ongoing displacement, the second around questions of family reunification and care, and the third, the lack of recognition of refugee rights. Each offers us a window into the conditions understood to be a prerequisite for sanctuary to be achieved. So I'm going to start with hospitality. In the 1950s and 1960s, ordinary British people opened their homes to European refugees to come for holidays in Britain, to give them, and I quote, glimpses of a life they have never known. These were those who had been displaced by the Second World War, who remained in European displaced persons camps while they waited for resettlement, employment, or emigration, which was often limited by age or by illness. Holiday schemes were formative in determining how Britain responded to refugees in the post-war period, foundational practice for what would become major refugee agencies, and creating expectations as to who refugees were and what they deserved. It allowed, usually well publicised, as you can see in this extract from the Worthing Herald, demonstration of British values of generosity and tolerance to temporary guests, brought entirely through charity, rather than integrating newcomers who needed to be found employment, housing, and potentially statutory support. So the examples here are really specific. This was temporary hospitality under the banner of a holiday, though it was often based on a recurring relationship, and there's some small charities who brought the same people back and forth year after year. These holiday makers were white Europeans from displaced persons camps, whose displacement and suffering was known and understood. The hospitality also took place in a Cold War context, where European divisions of East and West were urgent. Predominantly, these schemes were directed at children, whose assumed innocence and vulnerability means their subjecthood and agency as refugees and deservingness as recipients of charitable or voluntary work has been understood differently. And a number of these schemes had a kind of an educational motive in mind, that particularly for children who'd grown up in refugee camps, that they did need to be brought somewhere else in order to think about it, their lives there. One aspect of this process is how it draws attention to women's labour in this space. Sybil Oldfield, the historian, has explored the essential responsibility, carried by British women to ensure everyday success in the rescue and care of Kindertransport children. And we see this tracing through to refugee charities in the 1950s, where women dominated at executive levels. I'm thinking about Dame Anne May Kerwin, who was head of the British Council for Aid to Refugees, Joyce Pearce, whose charity Ockenden Venture, it started out as a holiday scheme, and then it became a school, and then they became one of the biggest agencies supporting refugee resettlement by the 1980s. So it kind of grew out of this big thing. But we also see women proliferating at all levels of charitable work, but particularly voluntary work on the ground. Significantly, refugee charities enabled women to take on key roles in determining frameworks of refugee settlement. So they developed international networks of refugee services. They navigated visa systems to get refugees into Britain. They used the press to shape narratives of refugees and adopted ways of working with refugees, which would shape charities' operations for decades, not least because lots of these women lived quite a long time and were running the charities at the top for decades. I want to focus particularly on the Worthing Refugee Relief Committee today, who had long been involved in helping refugees. During the Second World War, the committee had adopted the Huyton internment camp, sending parcels, making visits, and advocating for interned refugees. They did lots of fundraising through play and jumble sales, as well as taking direct donations. After the war, the committee continued its work supporting refugees, and holidays were a key part of this. The committee sponsored displaced persons from the Braunschweig camp to come on holiday to Worthing each summer. They supported their visa applications with the Home Office and provided accommodation either in local hotels or, more usually, with families who volunteered to have a refugee in their spare room. Travel fares were paid for directly by the supporters of the committee or by the Quaker Friends Service Council, who had field workers in the camp who acted as a point of liaison. And I think the kind of strand of religious sentiment, particularly Christian sentiment, that underpins this work is another key theme operating through actually all the way up to 2000 really in this work. So the refugees would be met by Dorothy Gundry, Joan Strange and other committee members at Liverpool Street Station. So these two women with their bags and the hats in the front. Once they arrived in Worthing, their days included activities supported by other voluntary, religious and civic institutions. So they'd be driving by the coach to go and visit the Inner Wheel Club. They'd have socials at the Friend's house or tea at the Bishop's Palace in Chichester. They usually visited Agnew House, which was a residential home for elderly refugees that was run by the British Council for Aid to Refugees, and it hosted quite a few Holocaust survivors. That kind of continuity in visiting was seen to be done then. The refugees were also taken to London on tours, and then there was also some space for traditional holiday activities, rest, relaxation, and being by the sea, which was seen to have kind of very therapeutic properties. What was interesting and what's held in the Worthing Record Office is it's now held in Chichester, is the correspondence between Dorothy Gundry, who was the honorary secretary of this committee, and Eileen Taylor, who was a member of the Quaker Friends Service Council who worked at the camp. And the letters between these two women reveal the perspectives of volunteers on the refugees they worked with. So Eileen Taylor provided snippets of information about those she was putting forward for holidays. She wanted the Worthing Organising Committee to realise the full circumstances of the displaced persons and to smooth the way for them, with the families being tasked with hosting duties. And this was particularly on a trip for a trip one year, which was exclusively teenage girls. And the notes that Eileen Taylor sends to Dorothy Gundry are largely preoccupied with the girls' intelligence, their job prospects, and their attractiveness. There's never an explicit point when she thinks it would be quite good for them to meet an English husband, but you can kind of see that this is sort of unofficial, maybe matchmaking service that's happening. She also offers her perspectives on their understanding of English. So improving language skills was one of the trip's major draws, that they would go to England for a holiday and come back with an English language, a degree of fluency. So to give you an insight into some of the things she said, Erica Tober, who was a Russian Roman Catholic, was a charming, well-educated girl. Nina Nastyuk, a Greek Catholic from Ukraine, was a well-behaved girl, but not nearly so intelligent as Erica Tobert. Sonia Lacer had more extensive notes, which I've put up here. She's not over-intelligent and has a slight speech impediment about which she is very sensitive. She is in that difficult age group which resents interference from parental influence. She and her mother do not get on very well, and Sonia is often not at home when she should be. She should be with a family who understands these growing problems and who have daughters of the same age and who will be kind but firm. As she made her selections, Taylor endeavoured to ensure that all those who made the journey would make a good impression on the people of Worthing. The group selected in April 1957 included several deserted and divorced women, and Taylor wrote, "These women don't seem to have a very good record, do they? So perhaps some of your nice English friends not ought to be told. Babies with unmarried mothers still bear a stigma in England, but somehow it is not so in camp life. You understand how these things are, but maybe others don't, and you don't exactly want that kind of information in the press." Following the visit 3 years later in 1960, the Worthing Committee asked those women who had hosted children for their holiday for some feedback on the experience. There was general enthusiasm for the scheme, and some were happy to repeat it, but it appeared that several of the hostesses were not happy with how the holiday had gone. A report from a meeting held suggested difficulties with the lack of English language, ideas of punctuality and foresight shown by the children, and their inability to entertain themselves in the evening. In their letters, the women also asserted the limits on their capacity to host and entertain. Pat Hendry wrote to Dorothy Gundry that, for purely personal reasons, I would rather not have another visitor. You will appreciate that I am not just an ordinary housewife and have to make special arrangements for a visitor of that kind and rely on the goodwill and cooperation of the rest of my family to make such an occasion a success. It's not clear what distinguished Hendry from other ordinary housewives, whether she had a particularly large family or some social responsibilities that she felt meant that she didn't have the time or effort to do this again. Madge Haynes tried to reassure Gundry and the committee that, despite the adverse comments of her fellow hosts, I hope these will not make the committee feel that the girls' holiday was a failure and should not be repeated. The effects of such a holiday must be beneficial, and we just cannot tell how far these good effects go. Haynes acknowledged that this was a lot of work, but the good that is done is worth all the trouble taken. One other concern that emerged was about whether the refugees deserved the holidays, or at least whether this deservingness was immediately evident. So if you go back to that previous picture, the committee minutes recorded that the apparent well-being of the visitors was something of a concern when poor and shabby refugees were expected. It's kind of a failure to understand that for those travelling from displaced camps, they might have really wanted to have their best clothes on to be photographed in the press and to make a good impression. In offering a glimpse of life beyond the camps, holiday schemes were limited hospitality interactions. More enduring were the forms of engagement that were established by the holiday schemes, where even those brief spells saw the imposition of conditions centred on refugees' deservingness. The desire of hosts to exercise control over who was invited to be guests, their behaviour, as well as itineraries which determined a display of civic hospitality, is evident in the management of these holidays. These schemes determined a conditional form of welcome, that they followed longer patterns of refugee work, local, female-led, volunteer-driven, reinforced a mode of engagement that expanded into Britain's major refugee agencies. Do you have to move around? I'd much rather watch you dance around the room. Okay, I'm going to move to my second process, which I'm kind of tentatively calling multicultural belonging. The mode of local, is it on here?
Sorry, carry on.
No. The mode of local and volunteer-driven work persisted throughout the 50s, the 60s, the 70s, the 80s, and indeed remains crucial to refugee resettlement today. Ockenden Venture, who I mentioned earlier, who started as a holiday scheme in Woking, grew to become one of the three agencies responsible for the resettlement of Vietnamese refugees in the late 1970s and 1980s, but continued their emphasis on the small and personal approach, which was very resource heavy in terms of how it was scaled up. But what was beginning to change in this period was the shift from dynamics of host-guest to the beginning recognition of refugees' rights. And this was increasingly informed by the adoption of multicultural and anti-racist approaches. So I've been thinking about what it might mean for sanctuary for refugees to be explicitly connected with a form of belonging that we might call multicultural, and how that belonging could be instrumentalized. And this might be in response to existing models of dispersal and assimilation. So dispersal, a bit like what it sounds, was the spatial management of refugees arriving through resettlement schemes, which aims to avoid the concentration of refugees in any one area. And this was supposed to support integration, and part of that integration was to avoid overburdening local councils and local communities with the resources, but also with the tolerance needed to have refugees settle in the area. And this system was often at the expense of refugees' well-being and ability to form community, and it frequently led to secondary migration to connect with existing diasporic groups. So it was really explicit during the arrival of Ugandan Asians in the 70s, where there were red and green areas, with red areas being places like London or Leicester or Birmingham, where there were existing South Asian communities. It was perceived in the sort of management that they were already too densely populated with South Asian people, so we wanted to spread the refugees elsewhere. Same thing happens to Vietnamese refugees. and leads to like horrific circumstances of refugees being sent to like very rural Scotland, for instance, where there's no resources, nobody who speaks their language, and kind of put into this real space of isolation. But it was also frequently contested by local people who didn't want refugees to move next door. And I've looked at an example in Birkenhead of the Woodchurch Tenants Association, and it was a council estate that was claimed to be a problem estate, but had lots of empty spaces in it. And it was suggested that some Vietnamese refugees might be placed there. And the Tenants Association rallied and prevented the charity from resettling refugees in those empty flats. So the dilution of refugee presence across the country required charities supporting resettlement to spread their efforts and attempt to mobilise local support groups, many of whom struggled with the demands of refugees whose culture felt very different from their own. And significantly, this could be in the engagement of refugee resettlement with multiculturalism as I quote, the succession of conscious efforts to make sense of and manage ethnically diverse and national levels. So we can place the project of sanctuary within the institution of multiculturalism in the growing rhetoric, policies, funding and provisions aimed at immigrants and refugees of colour and specific ethnic groups in Britain from the 1960s. Both of these aspects changed the emphasis of resettlement in the 80s as multiculturalism became a conscious process of belonging making and a resource, especially of funding for smaller groups, with a turn towards the refugee community organisation in this period. How did this manifest then in relation to the arrival of refugees from Vietnam? So Vietnamese refugees were subject to consistent rhetoric about their distinctiveness. They were Cold War refugees, but they weren't white Europeans. They were post-colonial, but they weren't from the former British Empire. Their race was a point of distinction. So we're thinking about refugees who are both ethnically Chinese and Vietnamese. Their language, Cantonese and Vietnamese. Their religion, their disadvantage, as the Home Office termed it, in terms of skills or employment experience relevant to life in Britain. Their lack of familiarity with Britain and even Western culture and traditions. Their description as our most foreign refugees fueled exceptionalism and distinctiveness, but also a sense of passivity. Here, the framework of self-help, mutual aid, multiculturalism and anti-racism offered scope for agency and pushback. On New Year's Day 1988, Refugee Action, which was a charity formed in 1981 out of Save the Children's Vietnamese resettlement programme, declared itself to be a Vietnamese agency, and Refugee Action still exists today, but with a much more expanded remit. And I quote, "The complete management and resources of Refugee Action will be taken over by staff who themselves left Vietnam as refugees. We believe this is the most appropriate and effective structure to meet the needs of Vietnamese refugees in Britain over the next 2 years." So in this turn to cultural appropriateness, we can see echoes of the voluntarism work rooted in working class communities and kinship networks, and the actions of activist groups in Black British and British Asian communities in the 1970s and 1980s. The fact that this comes out of Save the Children is not surprising. Save the Children Fund proved more responsive to multicultural practice and the value of refugee community involvement in this period. And I do think that partly that's due to the organisations grappling at that point with its own imperial inheritance, and Emily Bourne's fantastic book on Save the Children illuminates sort of those origins. The charity's work within the Vietnamese resettlement had two particularly significant aspects for understanding of refugees' multicultural belonging in Britain, both of which emphasised forms of care. So the first was the use of refugees as parasocial workers, and secondly, in their responsibility for unaccompanied refugee children. I'm going to focus on the latter, but I'm more than happy to talk about the former. So the latter, taking over the care of unaccompanied refugee children, was a major aspect of the charity's work, with a focus on residential homes. Initially, this was a matter of expedience, but it soon became policy. So Save the Children decided that fostering with Vietnamese families was not viable, partly because these families were still establishing their own homes in Britain, and partly because, and I quote, "the concept of fostering in our terms is not understood in the Vietnamese culture." It doesn't appear that any Vietnamese families were ever asked about this and whether they'd be willing to take in children. Fostering with British families was also ruled out to ensure that children retained their culture and language in the hope of successful future reunification, which is an interesting way to think about like the need for multiculturalism and kind of reuniting people or sending them home. The choice ran counter to contemporary British childcare practice, which was trending away from residential care and instead was emphasising the importance of family life. But in this case, it was believed that children would benefit from being cared with others of their own age and ethnic group, so that stable relationships with their own culture could be maintained. The aim of the residential homes was to create a Vietnamese atmosphere in which the children can feel secure, while they also receive education in English culture and customs and are able to attend local schools and so mix with native children. So in early 1981, a children's home for around 40 unaccompanied Vietnamese children was set up in Bishop Stortford with financial backing from the Home Office and the DHSS, as it was. Vietnamese house parents were employed alongside British staff, and the children normally spoke to each other in Vietnamese. Children were granted freedom to decide on everyday practices like how they looked after their own hair, and where they slept and how they slept based on their experiences. And it was found in reports from the centre that the children gave each other mutual support and older children took responsibility for the younger, which I think is a trend that is kind of unsurprising in the circumstances. What's interesting is how, say, the children place this work within changing cultures and social work and care. Staff members vociferously defended their methods of care. Robina Brand, who was the manager of Hampton Court House, which is the one you can see on the screen, where the home moved in 1982, described that it is the Vietnamese who endorse our way of caring, and it's really not for us to impose Western ways of caring upon them. And there's not really any explanation of what Western ways of caring are in this context, or who the endorsement is coming from beyond the Vietnamese people who are employed by the charity. In their submission to the House of Commons Social Services Committee in 1984, Save the Children used the example of Hampton Court House to suggest that similar forms of care might apply to other groups of ethnic minority children. In 1985, they organised a seminar on race, culture and childcare at Hampton Court House. And this was attention to race and ethnicity was fuelled by the organisation's broader work to institute both an equal opportunities policy and from 1986, an explicitly anti-racist approach. And this was based on a report that was called, based on the original founding of the charity, where it was meant to help children beyond and above all considerations of race, nationality and creed. They then reviewed the historic practices of Save the Children and discovered that actually hadn't been how they'd approached saving children in the past. So this report was meant to be a shift at that point. And it outlines the need for an anti-racist policy within Save the Children, to continue to uphold the rights of the child, to acknowledge the role of racism as a feature of most, if not all, organisations in Britain who'd done this kind of colonial work, and to reflect on assumptions that work undertaken in developing countries fulfilled obligations to Black people while overlooking racist practices at home. So what we can see in this process is a really interesting and I'm still figuring out what to do with this home, because in some ways you're thinking, okay, this degree of agency and care and of getting people involved, and it's based on a lot of research, but it's also fundamentally an institutionalization of these children and a way of kind of containing them, keeping them separate from the rest of the population. So I'm still struggling to think about what's happening in this space. But I think what we can see is a shift away from enthusiastic volunteers, as in the women in Worthing, to the development of an expertise that's informing how refugee resettlement is taking place, as well as the increasing influence of activism, especially anti-racist activism, in the work that's being undertaken by refugee charities. Okay. The final process I want to think about is resistance. Though this example is the most recent of the three that I'm talking about today, I in no way want to suggest that refugees only began resisting the conditions which they were offered in this moment. But what is particularly important about resistance in the late 1980s and 1990s are two aspects. First, the bridging of perceived or constructed gaps between migrants and refugees as they campaigned together. Second, the deployment of rights, which was historically innovative, which shifted discourses around refugees and asylum away from the host-guest dynamic and concomitant expectations of welcome and gratitude, which had dominated refugee responses across the 20th century. So these rights could specifically be human rights, as in Amnesty International's railing against abuses in detention centres. It could be equal rights. Test cases levied by the Joint Council for the Welfare of Immigrants use equal rights as their terminology. Or it could be a more capacious language of rights to ensure minimum standards of treatment. Rights were central to the campaign against Fortress Europe in the lead up to 1992. So 1992 was the year of the enactment of the Single European Market, and it represented a juncture in migration across the 12 member states. Who was going to be free to enter and move across this single market of labour, capital and goods? Who would get to belong to Europe? So while for many this was a very exciting prospect of the ability to travel freely across Europe, for others, as European borders shifted, so too did bordering regimes and the policing of asylum and migration. I think 1992 is a kind of coalescing moment for European states seeking to harmonise immigration policies in the wake of the single market. It's a moment when national borders were transformed into European frontiers. Campaign groups and activists mapped the deprivation of rights to refugees and asylum seekers onto broader immigration issues and onto the experience of Black Britons. So within harmonisation, this idea that there needs to be what was the lowest common denominator. No one wanted to be the soft point of entry, or to allow the kind of brokering of that chain in the fortress, which led to this deprivation of rights, increased surveillance and increased numbers of deportations. The one group who is especially lauded for their ability to, and I quote, sustain the links between racism and imperialism and between racial oppression and class exploitation was Refugee Forum. This group was seen by Sivanandan from the Institute of Race Relations as the future of the left, able to generate multifaceted political culture, building on the traditions of working class movements and anti-racist organisations. He positioned Refugee Forum in solidarity with recent actions in Southall after the murder of Blair Peach by the police in 1979 and Newham Defence Campaign. So this group was formed in 1984 at a conference of migrant, immigrant and refugee community groups supported by the GLC. And the GLC, the Greater London Council, is often the root cause of lots of these groups getting together and organising or having maybe a few hundred quid to go for a year, and then unfortunately for me, disappearing into the ether. So Refugee Forum was led by Ronnie Moodley, whose background was as a Christian pastor and a refugee. And it had close relationships with the campaign against racism and fascism and evangelical Christians for racial justice. And it was deeply embedded in the anti-racist movement. It acted as an umbrella organisation for refugees and community activists, not only in their fight against racism, but developing and promoting self-help community programmes. Its radicalism included its tactics. It was involved in highly publicised sanctuary cases for those threatened with deportation, so that they would organise a church or a mosque or a temple where someone would stay and they would support their kind of keeping them within a religious sanctuary. And they also talked openly about their organisation of an underground railway, as had existed in the States during slavery, for asylum seekers. So secret safe houses where those without permission to stay in the UK would be housed. As Moody described, this quiet breaking of laws was working in Christ's way and a moral obligation. And I quote, "Civil disobedience is a necessary quality of Christian mission wherever the laws of a society do gross damage to human beings." I think we can see some of that same rhetoric in Christian involvement in the climate crisis activism today. I've been thinking about kind of its relationship to civil disobedience. Refugee Forum was also famed for its extremely critical view of virtually all other NGOs in the refugee arena, and they were deeply suspicious of all those who didn't share its grassroots activist approach. And there's some fantastic letters that Ronnie Moodley has just written to other charities being like, you shouldn't be doing this, you have no right to be doing this work. At a conference organised by the Joint Council for the Welfare of Immigrants in 1989, a spokesperson from Refugee Forum stated that we cannot work with other agencies who have become so professional, so adept at playing with the Home Office, that they have become another Home Office. The Forum demanded self-determination for refugee communities, separate from those who have made an industry out of refugees. But the one thing they did have in common with these more moderate groups was the production of a Charter of Rights in response to Fortress Europe. And there's so many refugee charters that are kind of created in this moment. Refugee forums had 6 clauses: equal rights for every refugee granted asylum in any EC member country, entitlement to welfare rights and benefits, an independent appeal system, expeditious processing of applications, the opportunity to obtain permanent residence, and the right of refugees to have information and services to support at points of arrival in their own language. And these were very much the same points that were being made by other campaign groups, including Amnesty International. So the difference was in the tactics and the style through which these rights were defended, especially in hiding asylum seekers from the authorities, and the collaboration which shifted the focus beyond refugees. The movie was involved in this publication, Whose Europe Faced Racist Fortress or Equal Rights, which was sponsored by other groups, including the Action Group on Immigration and Nationality, the Indian Workers Association, and the Runnymede Trust. In 1989, the Forum joined with the Migrant Rights Action Network, which many of their activities involved lobbying and campaigning on behalf of migrants and undertaking consciousness-raising work on migration. Together, the two groups developed a manifesto for migrants and refugees in Europe, which was kind of one step beyond the Charter, I think, which was advertised through periodicals. This reframing further distinguished them from the more moderate campaigners and marked their intention for change beyond minimum standards. They refused to separate issues affecting refugees and migrants and instead proposed a collective vision for change. At the heart of this was the activism and lived experience of refugees and migrants themselves, the fuel through which broader attention was garnered. So while these campaigns had limited success in turning the tide of the UK's treatment of refugees and asylum seekers, an important legacy of their campaigning work is the continued employment of rights by campaigners in their fight to resist Fortress Europe, even as Britain made its exit. And we can see this in the prevention of the first plane being designated to take asylum seekers from the UK to Rwanda, as I talked about at the start, being prevented by a ruling from the European Court of Human Rights. Rights for refugees, asylum seekers and migrants have become one of the few obstacles to measures of deterrence and removal, and that's the legacy of campaigns of the 1990s. What I've shown through these 3 case studies then is the extent and diversity of the sanctuary project in modern Britain, and just a few of the many processes through which sanctuary was created and defended. While the direction of travel at a legislative level has been one of increasing hostility and restriction, a vast range of people have been involved in trying to make sanctuary possible for those who had already entered into Britain and for the others yet to arrive. Importantly, the major transition across these processes was the increasing involvement of refugees leading and participating to determine what sanctuary might best serve them. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Anna, for a fascinating talk, for contextualising and conceptualising the issue of sanctuary. Now, what we're going to do now is we're going to move on. I'm going to ask 3 leading members of the Modern History Research Centre to comment on the subject, develop or expand on the subject. And I'm going to start off with Dr. Emily Stars, who's a lecturer in modern history here, and she specialises in the history and representation of forced migration. She's a member of the University's Forced Migration Network and is collaborating with Winchester City Sanctuary to create a series of exhibitions on the theme of forced migration. So thank you, Emily.
Check you can see me at home. Okay, thank you. Well, so while you were talking, I was frantically writing things that I wanted to respond to, and there's so much I had to start circling so I would know what to draw out. That was so interesting, and I think one of the things I really thought about is the idea of this hostile environment, and the idea I came to histories of forced migration through thinking. I was approached by Winchester City of Sanctuary to put on a series of exhibitions on sanctuary in Winchester, and it was proposed to me that Winchester has always been a very welcoming place, and as a historian, that immediately kind of got me thinking, no, that's probably the narrative, but not the reality. And the more digging I did at that, the more I realised actually there's some truth in it. And there's a very big difference between this idea of a hostile environment and this kind of local level initiatives, which creates the very opposite, like it pushes back against this hostile environment. So I think what you did really nicely there, I'm not just giving feedback, but what I really liked about that is that you really kind of draw out this idea that what the government are doing, and you started out with that idea, you know, the kind of official narrative, as it were, it's never the same. Once you start digging down, it's a much more complicated story. One other thing, just while I'm remembering it, you mentioned the idea about refugees in rural Scotland, and it reminded me of, I don't know if anyone's ever seen the film Limbo. Yeah, so I would always, I would recommend it because it's a really interesting, it's fictional, but it's fictional based on reality, in the idea that asylum seekers are just dumped in rural Scotland and they're in limbo, as the film title would suggest, that we leave asylum seekers in this situation for up to 10 years and they'll not necessarily know an outcome as to whether they can stay. I was involved in asylum seeker education a few years back. I still do bits of it, but not so much. Where the film Limbo, they do these education sessions, and that's what I used to do. So it's quite funny for me to watch. But the idea that we're asking, for example, asylum seekers to learn English, to integrate, and they have no idea if they can stay, and this can happen for years. So motivation for coming to my English classes, for example, was exceptionally low, and I didn't blame them for that. But I think that really struck me is thinking about this idea of refuge and refugees doesn't necessarily apply to asylum seekers because they're not refugees yet. And they might not ever be refugees. The statistics on how many are actually granted refugee status are quite shocking. A lot of asylum cases are thrown straight out and solicitors never see them until they go to appeal. So it's not an easy, gaining refugee status is not an easy thing to get. And it also struck me then that labels are really important. So whether we're calling somebody a forced migrant, a refugee, an asylum seeker, we have different ideas of what these things are. They have different legal definitions, but also it affects how we respond to those, and it feeds into this idea of a deserving migrant. So the idea that a refugee has a place in British society, if we're thinking about it in that kind of national context, a refugee has a place in British society because they've been persecuted. You know, we have a heritage of hospitality, as Anna mentioned. We provide the sanctuary as part of our British values. But in actual fact, there are a lot of forced migrants that are, if we were to play into the rhetoric, equally deserving. But the problem is that it creates this idea, it feeds into this narrative of who is deserving and who is not deserving. And that always means that we can shut the borders at any point to anyone that we don't believe. And that can shift and change. It's not fixed. So those are just some things, and I realise we're short on time, so I don't want to hog the floor. But those are some things that I was thinking about, and I will pass over to the next speaker so I don't dominate. Thank you.
Thank you, Emily. Well, if I could invite Dr. Xavier Gagan up next, who's senior lecturer in colonial and post-colonial history and works on British colonial rule in South Asia and French colonial rule in North Africa. Thank you, Xavier.
Thanks again for a fantastic paper. And as Chris just mentioned, I mean, my background is much more 19th century and British and French perspectives. But actually, there are a couple of things from your paper I thought was very interesting that I want to comment on. And your paper is very much, of course, post-war. period, so the second half of the 20th century. And from some of the elements you were talking about, if I may, I would like to reflect a bit on things that today, but going back also to the 19th century, so kind of bridging these different periods. I do like the whole, I find it fascinating, the whole idea of the big-hearted nation, because that's something I find highly problematic, not because I think that everyone is mean and awful, but it's actually a creation of a type of rhetoric you see in so many nations. The French have something very similar, many nations will have something similar. And yet each nation believe that it's something that's connecting to themselves. So this is very British. But is it really very British? And actually, in many cases, it's not. And it's very common amongst many countries and nations. So why defining oneself like that, or a nation that way? And from what you were mentioning, that there's a lot to do with presentation of identity. And what I thought was also interesting, perhaps from something else I'm working on, is Life in the UK test and the textbook, which is awful. But which is connected with people migrating or people who are refugees, and eventually if they are settling, and eventually if they want to have security or some sort of safety, they very often they will have to take this kind of test if they want to get some citizenship or some security in the countries they arrive in. And the Life in the UK test really plays a lot on using or misusing, as Mark Ferro says, the abusing of history. And it's interesting from the elements you were showing off. I can really think that back to previous centuries, but how it's described in 21st century textbooks about British history and this idea of being a welcoming nation and so on. And yet, when you look at the different parts of the textbook when it comes to the historical concept, well, first of all, really wondering what is the practicalities of history here? What is the misuse of history? Why using history and this idea of concept of identity? And the whole idea of being a big-hearted nation actually appears a lot in the citizenship textbook. It's the idea that the British nation that come here, do all the tests, and you will belong to a society that welcomes you. However, and that put lots of barriers, lots of difficulties for people to become a British citizen. What is interesting is when it comes to racial perspectives. So, and I think that was very interesting also with, especially in the second and third part of your paper. So, for example, something I work a lot about is India, and for example, all the negative aspects, all the things that actually British people or some British people definitely not being kind and not be welcoming to Indian people in the 19th century, 20th century, it doesn't appear much. However, we learn that, and you have to learn that by heart, just for everyone who one day want to do it, if you want to pass the test to become British citizen, that there was an Indian restaurant open in London in the 1840s. That is the extent of British Indian history, which of course is highly problematic. Who is it serving to talk about an Indian restaurant? Why are we talking about this idea of having Indian restaurant, food, Indian food in 19th century Britain, which evolves toward 20th and 21st century? Is it really for an Indian person who was seeking for this kind of citizenship to feel welcome? But welcome as what? As a term which is very derogatory nowadays is a coolie, which is, of course, a term that was used in British language for a very long time, but something like an Indian servant to the British people. This is, to me, not the idea, even in the citizenship test today, not a representation of a nation that is welcoming or engaging with people coming in, but actually still, even the rhetoric of misusing history or pointing out a very specific point of history, the idea that, and the thing to remember about Indian people in the 19th century in Britain is they opened restaurants. And that is this idea of subservitude. So these are also something when it comes to migration, generally speaking. I mean, Irish populations are described, but again, not many other migration, even though we know that 19th century is still the century of migration. I mean, that's the other thing with refugees or asylum seekers or other type of migrants. We focus as if there are a lot, but actually in world history, the 19th century is still the century of the biggest migration around the world, a movement of people, not the 20th century. And of course, 21st century was still at the beginning. We don't know what's going to happen, but it's still not showing the same signs as 19th century. And yes, we are obsessed with this idea of migration that could be portrayed negatively. The other thing I really liked also, I found very interesting also in your paper, was this portrait of children, especially the Vietnamese children, and the portrait of basically thing that is a justifiable cause and so on. And again, that is very interesting with using photography. That's something else I work a lot on. And we can really see from the 1890s, this kind of the first type of photography reportage about using children, usually poor children, but white children still at that stage, about the idea that, oh, something has to be done to help people because of these poor white children living on the street. Now, what I find interesting is, in the sense, that is not a nation that were thinking that way, is some individuals who are campaigning. And I think that also came across with what you were talking to us. It's about individuals campaigning rather than a nation, or rather than that this idea of whether it's a whole people or some people. So just to, because I can see Chris coming, so my time is coming. But just that this idea of saving children, saving that as part of a kind of campaigning, is interesting. You really start seeing that from the transition to the 19th, 20th century, not much earlier. And then is when actually visuality, like the photography comes along that can be used, you can really start seeing that process developing further. But at the same time, I just want to go back again, this idea of is it really British or not? And more and more terms today are used as, for example, we say post-colonial France, post-colonial Britain. So the idea of post-coloniality is not just the countries that were colonized and now they are, it's actually the country, what's called the mother countries during the empires that were the center of empire. They also are, in the sense, post-colonial Britain, post-colonial France, and so on. And again, it's all of this, for me, what I find interesting is this idea of campaigning the identity. And to what extent Britishness, Frenchness, all of these, are they really that unique? Or is it actually more because of people campaigning who are actually trying to create a narration behind it, perhaps to help their causes by creating this idea of national identities?
Okay. Thank you, Xavier. Okay, and I'd like to finish off by inviting Dr. Graciela Iglesias-Rogers to provide the last comment, and she's senior lecturer in modern European global Hispanic history and principal investigator of the International Research Network, the Hispanic Anglosphere, I have to get this right, transnational networks and global communities, 18th to 20th centuries. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Chris. And you gave us a lot of food for thought, enormous food for thought. And I do agree with Javier's point about the thing of being welcoming and being, a good place for refugees is something that probably shared by every nation. But I do disagree. I think there is something that is particularly British, and it has to do with the history, and it has to do with the 19th century. And obviously I'm going to say it has to do with the Hispanic world. That is that, and if I can show you very quickly something from, let's see if I can find it now. Not as your presentation. You may not find it. Something that I usually show to my students. If I go to desktop, that should be there. No, it's not going to appear as usual. Ah, yes, European demographics. Here we are. Just this nice map, which is that in the 19th century, as you said, there's this enormous massive migration, and Europe is net exporter of people, and the Americas is net importer of people, and Britain is a great exporter of people. There's thousands of Scottish, Irish, Welsh, who go English, who migrate for economic reasons, a few for political reasons, but mainly for economic reasons, and who are received by mainly the US and Argentina. Argentina still to this day has the most important Welsh colony in the world, in Patagonia. In the 19th century, had 2 English-speaking newspapers, and the most important community, foreign community in Argentina was the British community. And that's something that perhaps people tend to forget. But at the same time, interestingly, Britain was the host of a lot of political refugees from the Hispanic world. And enough, the reaction was mixed. And there were things that were, there are echoes of the reaction today in some way, or we can recognize things that happened then today. There were reactions that were racial because they saw Hispanics, their dark face of the Hispanics was not very appealing for a lot of people in England. Even when some darker face Hispanics were, even a few of them, they were coming from Andalusia and they were from Anglo background, even when they were from Anglo background, they could speak perfectly English because they had dark face. Somehow they were unappealing. And they were received relatively all right for a couple of years, 2 years, mainly between the 1820s and 1830s. By the 1830s, they really want the Hispanics out of London, particularly, and the British government has to even to pay to the Hispanic people to actually go back to Spain if they could, or to South America if they were from South America, or to they actually made a scheme to send them somewhere, not to Rwanda, but to send them to the Channel Islands. And you go to Jersey, even to this day, there's a big Hispanic community in Jersey. So I think we can find perhaps the origins of much of the idea of Britain as a bridge, as a place, because the Hispanic people were using Britain as a way of a place where they could stay while the political situation was bad for them. And as soon as they could, or they were pushed, they would leave. So this idea that Britain can really be a good host, but for a short period of time. And perhaps the big difference that I can see between the 19th century is what you mentioned about the difference between the state and the third sector. And in the 19th century, we don't have a third sector. But in the 20th century, we do have a third sector. And I found very interesting what you have to say about sometimes the inadequacies of the third sector too. We tend to blame the state for a lot of the issues, but sometimes the issues are coming from the third sector. So perhaps we could be discussing that in the rest of the talk. Okay. Oh, thank you very much. That's as much as I wanted to say. I'll stop the sharing now. And yes, supposedly we should have the main view now here, but I'm not sure. It's brilliant. That's it. That's it. So I think we could perhaps.
Yes, let's invite some questions from the floor and online to our invited speaker, Anna, about her paper. And if we want to broaden out the issues, then let's do that.
And you're struggling to where we fit in. I remember that period of time, and it seemed to me very similar to what was happening in the 70s, disabled children. I lived on an estate where there was a home for disabled children, and they were very much kept segregated from us. And as a community, we actually went in and did jumble sales and things like to raise money for them. But they still weren't allowed to come out and play with us and things like that. It was very, very odd.
Yeah, that's a really interesting way of putting like an interesting parallel, one that I'm going to think about a bit more. There seems to be a preoccupation in the UK, and actually I think my colleague Matthew Hilton, who's working on humanitarianism more broadly in this similar period of kind of containing people or institutionalizing people, even with the asylums closing down and things happening. That's happening. One of the things that happens that Refugee Council is really preoccupied with is with the move towards care in the community and the closing of asylums, what they would do with refugees who were perceived to not have a community. And I do wonder why the opposite of community is an institution, but that's a really, really helpful parallel to think about. Yeah, thank you.
Can I just say a point?
Yeah.
Suddenly thought, was the idea, and you won't necessarily have an answer, but is the idea of care in the community more about reintegrating those who were segregated from those ways? So the emphasis then is integrating refugees. And we know that integration means anglicising, basically. So I wonder whether there's something in that puts pressure on this idea of assimilation. Because so it reminded me of I was looking at some handbooks from the 1930s on how to behave as a refugee. So they were given largely to Jewish migrants on not standing out in the crowd and making sure you're really English, but not just English, but the best version of English. So you know, it stand out. So I wonder whether that feeds into it as well, this idea of integration.
There's definitely, and there's also so it's thinking about integration but also a sense of refugees' capability to integrate. I think it's always something that's being measured either by the state or by charities in this period. And there are some groups who they seem to assume just don't have the capacity to integrate. So the big study that's done on refugees as they get older, particularly where perhaps dementia or other illnesses could lead to a forgetting of English language skills, but also that if someone had arrived here, and this kind of, again, this is where the expansiveness of what refugee covers, this might be people who'd arrived as European voluntary workers after the Second World War, but who maybe didn't have a family in this country and would be isolated, or had been so well served by diasporic groups that they had failed to make any connections beyond that group, but then now didn't have that ability to make the connection. But yeah, there's always this idea of like, who can we integrate and who can't? And I think that's why with the Vietnamese case, their Auckland Adventure, who were this kind of really, they get really heavily criticised for their work with Vietnamese refugees because they try and establish these very small local voluntary befriending groups because they seem to need so much additional support to help to integrate, and they end up becoming kind of like Christian evangelical kind of type things, and they're proselytizing to the refugees and trying to convert them, or the volunteers basically just get frustrated and bored that it's taking too long. They're like, after 6 months we should be done with this work, why are we still doing this? We want to go back and help other people usually in our church community instead. So there's kind of real that frustration of like what assimilation might look like.
If we have questions at home, you can raise your hand. Unmute yourself into the question. In the meantime.
So in the second half of the 19th century, especially from the 1860s, 70s, there's a rise of humanitarianism and the creation of the Red Cross and all of this. And then it's very much connected at the time with famines around empires and this idea of how to protect people who are starving to death and all of this. At the time, the politics, of course, led by men, were describing this as female hysteria. So anything like groups trying to help people were perceived as suffering were female hysteria. And that actually carried on for a very long time, from the second half of the 19th century to the beginning of the 20th century. In your research, have you found a gender perspective or I don't know, a characterization about people campaigning to help refugees or asylum seekers, or is there a kind of a gendered view? Yeah,
I think it's particularly in the 50s and 60s. So the groups who get tasked with resettlement schemes and the study starts in 51 because that's when the first the UN Convention on the Rights to Refugee are introduced, and so the British Council for Aid to Refugees is set up in response. And it acts as kind of an umbrella organisation, and then the number of the people that it brings together are people who have been working in nascent social services, the Women's Royal Voluntary Services. So lots of it's very dominated by women, because I think it's seen at that point as a care issue. So it's something that's to do with it's family, it's in the home. There's a kind of relationship, particularly once refugees arrive. There's lots of visiting and social work that's happening. A bit like, I don't know if anyone knows Becky Taylor's work on problem families, but it's the same kind of like very, very 19th century, in fact, of sort of like nice middle class ladies going around and checking that the refugees are behaving themselves and not causing any trouble. It's where it starts, I think, to shift in terms of the thing with the refugee charities is they start moving from a kind of process of emptying the camps to responding to new refugee arrivals. And when that starts to happen and it starts to get more entangled with foreign policy and international geopolitics, and sort of the 60s, the beginnings of the professionalization of groups like Oxfam, that kind of moment in the 60s, the rediscovery of poverty in Britain, where it starts to become a bit more professionalized. And it's kind of a similar story to that you see in a lot of charities, and that's where the gender balance starts to get a little less visible or obvious. It's really interesting working with the archives of these charities because so many people jump from one charity to another, or they're related. There's these brothers called the Ennals brothers who pop up in so many different charities, and trying to keep track of who they are and what exactly they're doing is really interesting. I think then the main tension is one about experience of displacement. Then it becomes the tension as we move through to the 80s. So who is best able to support refugees, and should that be done by refugees themselves or people who have had some experience, or should that at least be part of the story, I think?
And in the 60s, 70s, when you, 50s, 70s, when it comes to the governments or the politicians' engagement with those charities, because there's still many male.
Yeah.
How do they react? Do they use this kind of language or like historians, or are they more moderate in their approach? Or?
They're more moderate in their approach, but I think there's occasionally language of like, oh, this crisis has been overblown. It's not necessarily as bad as it feels or as it seems, which is why I think refugee charities are really good at collecting evidence. And the British Council for Aid to Refugees, as Refugee Council today, has always had people going out to refugee camps and collecting evidence and bringing it back as part of making that case. But I think it's also because a lot of these charities were very cooperative with the government. So there's less of the explicit tensions that we maybe get to in the later period are less seen there, because they're getting paid or commissioned by their government to be, you will be the resettlement leader for the Hungarian refugees, and we will give you the money to do that work and your charity will grow. So there's a slightly less contentious relationship. It's interesting to know some of the MPs who get a lot of letters are often the women MPs who are supporting refugees. So Judith Hart in the 70s, to Labour MP, real big supporter of Chilean refugees arriving after the coup, and she gets some horrific letters from people who claim that it's just because she's a socialist, it's nothing to do with and some very kind of misogynistic language, but I think it's more about her politics and
because obviously I said there was no third sector in the 19th century, and it was exaggerated. Obviously, the church was always there, home, the nation very, but they were not specialized refugees organizations. So when is it that we specialized refugee organizations? But after the Second World War?
I think it's with after the Second World War, it's when UNRWA is set up, the UN Refugee Resettlement Agency gets set up. It's when the UNWRA gets placed in Palestine, Israel-Palestine, and thinking about their work there. But it's also when charities, or either as umbrella organisations or start to include refugees or displaced people in their remit, which I think there's some earlier iterations. So with child refugees from the Basque region in the 30s. There's in the Belgian refugees during the First World War, there's some particular charities that get set up there. But on a national scale, it's in the 50s. So it's more local work before that point. Yeah. And obviously, Jewish organizations are involved with huge amounts of refugee work.
How far have it specialized organizations in some way in developing an understanding of how different refugees that before was non-existent, and again because the situation was short-term or believed to be short-term.
A lot of it is about specialization, and lots of policy work that develops, and if you're thinking about the rise of experts, refugees is a really easy way of tracing the rise of expertise in this period, of different methods of them being shared across European nation states as well, but also from the range of sectors that they draw upon that work. So from the health sector, and thinking about the relationship to the new NHS, housing, social policy, and then thinking about where that expertise then gets deployed on the ground. So to go back to Emily's point of actually most of these charities' work is largely local, even though they're national organisations, they're devolved in terms of the work they do locally. So then it's about maybe getting 1 or 2 refugee officers into the local council to do that work at that point. So it becomes this whole infrastructure. Yeah, it's really interesting.
I was just thinking, do we also think it's the conceptualization of what a refugee is shifts so drastically that political refugees are something very different, and the idea of refugees moving from conflict and persecution who are impoverished and everything that comes with that, it's just a very different conceptualization, I think, of refuge, and so that warrants a different response, doesn't it? So political refugees were really useful for Britain because they showed this is what we're not. You know, we're going to give them refuge. We can have that. You know, we can have those British values because we're protecting them from those terrible regimes. So, but that's because they were kind of safe in that sense.
Yeah.
Whereas it starts to become a problem, doesn't it? Especially as you start to see kind of masses of migrants coming. I guess the obvious one I could think of is Jewish pogroms in Russia. So we get masses of refugees, and then it becomes a problem. Yeah, it's a problem before that, but it becomes this kind of wider scale problem. So how you respond to that is very different. So yeah, I guess it's that shifting conceptualization, shifting all of that kind of plays into it, I think.
Yeah, and there's a kind of presumption of a lack of capital, not only in terms of like actually financial capital, but cultural resources and connections. There's a real presumption that refugees haven't been mobile prior to their arrival in the UK. There's real upset at the thought that they might go somewhere else afterwards, that Britain might be a stepping stone on the journey. And I think that a lot of that is to do with this sense of who the refugee is and the expectations of, which persists all the way through. There's a really great memoir called Bluebird by Vesna. I can't remember her surname, but if you search for it, but it's about she was a refugee who arrived in the UK in the 90s from Bosnia, and she ended up staying in Kendal in North Yorkshire, and they get brought to a jumble sale to pick out some clothes, and one of the ladies ends up with this like beautiful fur coat, and then they're walking down the street and it's like, I didn't expect refugees to look like this and to live this way, and like you still see those, which is actually feel like quite Victorian attitudes towards like the demonstration of poverty and need, and the need to be able to see that visually, I think is really interesting.
That's so interesting as well, because it feeds into the idea that they're in need, therefore we'll help them.
Yeah.
Because I went to university with a Bosnian refugee, and her family were incredibly wealthy. They didn't have the image of what you would see as this kind of neediness. And when you present that as a refugee, suddenly the public go, no, hold on a minute.
Yeah.
Because they're taking our resources that we don't have. So it becomes more difficult to create that wide level of sympathy for people that seemingly don't need it.
Yeah.
Which is, I think, part of the major issues with how we think about refugee living.
Following on from that, when do you start seeing the use of the term, which is a disparaging term, somehow less economic migrants? When do you start to see that, i.e. not proper migrants, people who are just coming here from opportunities?
Yeah, so just to kind of connect to that, because I found it really interesting the bridging the gap between refugees and migrants in that final section. But the earlier periods were also periods of labour migration.
Yeah.
So and the kind of economic migrant of the 1950s was also very present in British society. So was there kind of a connection between the definition of the refugee or the perception of the refugee and the conceptual relation of migrant?
Yeah, so it's really good questions. So in the 50s, they're working off the UN's definition of who a refugee is. So it's someone who has escaped persecution or suffering, and it's specifically connected to the events of the Second World War and Europe. So it's really closely defined. It then gets, when the Hungarian Revolution happens in 56, like, okay, well, that kind of still just about fits. So yeah, these people are refugees, although that's when we start to see some questions. A lot of single young men arrive from Hungary, and they are often then being placed in mining towns. They get big resistance from trade unions there, who are already feeling slightly under threat. And there's, some of the events that happened at the hotels in Liverpool last year, some of the kind of earlier kind of riots and raiding were happening on the lodging houses of Hungarian refugees in there, and they were being seen more as economic, that kind of framing of you're tipping into being an economic migrant here, actually, you're not who's needed. But there's a real aim by the charities, I think, to make sure that their refugees are kept distinct from other forms of other kind of categories of migrants in this period, I think partly to justify the treatment that they're receiving and how it's operating. There's a real debate in the 60s, so 67 is when there's a change in the definition of who a refugee is, and it takes the definition beyond Europe. And there's a real debate in the British Council for Aid to Refugees about old refugees and new refugees being those who are coming from outside Europe and whether they count. And the kind of big drama is about the categorization of Chilean refugees as refugees and whether they should be seen as political threats, terrorists even entering the country, which is,
The problem is that the UK government recognize the government of Pinochet.
Exactly. So then the refugee disappears, right? So yeah, thank you.
And I think that, sorry, and then I will. It's just because it's directly on that point. Yeah. I think in theory there is there's those legal frameworks and there's those distinctions, but in practice, not always, I don't think, because a lot of the refugees that came over avoiding Nazi persecution actually came over as economic migrants. They got working visas. It was their only way out of the country. So I guess, yeah, in practice, these definitions really blur, I think.
Yeah,
Exactly. This would be
yeah.
These categories were.
In the 80s and 90s around Fortress Europe, Sivanandan talks about how refugees wear their passports on their faces, and actually by virtue of just being identified as someone who was not white, you could be and that's where the kind of the ability to generate solidarity across anti-racism, across migrant groups and across refugee groups was there, because it was so visibly these kind of regulations, you couldn't tell who was a refugee or who was not, or who was a migrant or who was not. It's that questioning of belonging and identity, particularly for second and third generation Black British and British Asian people, was a real concern in that moment. So I think, yeah.
Just picking up on what you were saying, I think there is a class to this in terms of how people respond to migrants and refugees, because if you think about what you were saying about programming and stuff, we had the massive, and that when people started to worry about immigration, and we get legislation coming in from the government, and that legislation is driven largely by a portion of London that's putting pressure, because they're feeling pressure in terms of where they live, where they work. And again, you picked up again there, and I think it's almost a sense of getting back to limited resources. They're coming in and taking our resources. And that's when you get the kind of class element, and there's this sense almost other people can afford to be nice and we can't. I mean, having grown up in the East End of London, I can remember going to school and having the National Front campaigning outside our school, because it was a largely Jewish school. And that's why, and you have this sort of almost changing image of these people depending on where they settle and the economic situation at the time. Everybody's quite happy, like we needed them for nursing and doctors and things. So when the economics are good, there is this hospitality in the nation. But it almost seems like globally now, the doors are shutting everywhere to refugees and migrants. And it's going to become a much bigger problem with climate change and people moving further north to get away from the heat and things like that.
Yeah. And I think you're right, like it's that perceived scarcity or the real lived experience of scarcity that's like that has an impact here. So that's one of the Woodchurch Tenants Association, one of the arguments that they make is like, well, we're already deemed a problem estate. Why would we be given another problem? Like you've told us that we're a problem. You've taken away they've closed the shop on the estate, they've taken away like the post office, the leisure centre is closed down. And then like, why would you want to add more here, like and kind of create another layer of support that actually isn't available to the people who live here, which I think is like the sort of the way that class are managed here, and thinking about how charity operates actually in this kind of moment of easier, giving a bit of money rather than actually thinking about what the resources it takes to bring someone here. There's a lot of desire in the UK at all levels to do more international aid and development support to avoid refugees coming in the first place. That's the biggest kind of political drive.
I think that economic aspect is historic, that competition of resources is the enduring theme of the experiences of forced migrants particularly. So one thing that I thought of is, for example, in France, when Jews were emancipated, one group of Jews were, but not another. And a lot of that came down to they were competing for jobs in a particular region. And I think that narrative is so embedded that it's us or them, that's part of the problem with the, I guess, the rhetoric on migration generally, is that's not a reality, but that's what we're kind of led to build up publicly. That's what we're led to be, and that's politically useful.
It is. It's really politically useful. And you can see how threatening it is when it goes the other way. So during this Chilean solidarity campaign, real areas of like places that were being threatened with deindustrialization, real areas of like high unemployment and poverty, thinking about Scotland and Sheffield particularly, have really strong union bases, and it was through the trade unions that the Chileans were hosted and the resources were shared. And you think actually that's why that movement was particularly threatening to the government, because they're saying actually, oh right, we can't drive a wedge between these groups and these places, it's not working. So yeah.
Just on this, with back in the 19th century, actually it's interesting that this political play with a group of people in citizenship goes back earlier. So in 1863-64, this La Loi Crémieux, the Crémieux law in Algeria, where basically the French started to feel they would be undermined the citizens by Muslim Arabs in Algeria. Therefore, they gave to all the Jewish people citizenship to become neo-French. And not because actually the Jewish population was very embracing Frenchness, and not at all. It was a political move to give more numbers to the colonizer versus the colonized people who they were perceived Muslim. But that created in that region further tension between Muslim groups and Jewish groups. And eventually the far right from the white French by the 1880s and 90s were starting to fight both the Jewish and anti-Semitic and anti-Islam. So all of this is also this kind of game that they play to have the upper hand politically and so on. I think there's a very strong record in modern history of how badly it turns. And it turns to actually people really, communities fighting each other, where sometimes they're not originally.
Yeah.
And back to the very first slide, where we're talking about hospitality, which again, I agree with Zada, I think it's quite problematic in our history. But if people can come to accept that they can bring something to the country, and not talk about people coming in, the people accepting them, recognise that it's not about them becoming British, it's about British and then combine and taking on other values and other things and learn things. I mean, you only have to look about the food culture in this country. No food, almost, There's not much British food really, for people classically British exists. And we have to kind of accept and learn those things, but doesn't seem to be any move education system to do that. I mean, I just looked up in facts online before I came out, and one of the things I noticed was they were saying about how many doctors come up as refugees or asylum seekers, and we don't take them on. But it costs something like 25,000 to retrain a foreign doctor and 250,000 to train a British one. Now, if things like that were perhaps more well known, people might just be a little bit more accepting.
That's something that you said in your talk that bring about you, which is you mentioned multiculturalism as a process of belonging. And that's the case.
Yeah.
Because from my experience, coming from a country that considers itself, like Argentina, considers itself not a cultural country, but an integrist country where you become integrated, but from various cultures. When I came here, this idea that you have, leaflets with 20, 25 different languages to explain things, I thought that's excluding people. That's a way of telling people you don't need to learn English. You keep your language because you're going to go back. So that was my first reaction. And I wonder how far, I mean, multiculturalism is really a process of belonging, or is actually a process of keeping you as you are.
Yeah.
So you can go back home.
Yeah. I think that's a really helpful point. So I think part of it is seeing multiculturalism as that institution. So it provides those structures that enables, you know, the specialization, the thinking about refugee community organizations, which often then entrench power dynamics within those groups. And you get one group who becomes, well, we are the dominant narrative of X group who've arrived from here. And if you're not in our group, then you're not really part of it, you know, that kind of thing that happens. So the resourcing of multiculturalism in that way. And I think what the other bit is the kind of multicultural drift that Stuart Hall talks about, the ways through which particular areas become multicultural just through the process of who lives there and how they occupy the space, which to me feels, you know, that kind of, it's mediated and it's contingent and it's tense and it's not all kind of sunshine and roses, but is a kind of better, is a more realistic picture, I think, of how multiculturalism actually operates. I don't think a multiculturalism that suggests that everyone has an equal stake in the society exists at all in the UK. I've got one online.
Yeah.
Part of the observation or the question. Political refugees can be, depends on the optics. The Chilean refugee is an embarrassment because we're recognising Pinochet. Back in 1848, Kossuth led the Hungarian Revolution, comes to Britain, does a speaking tour, including Southampton and Winchester. Very much helps to create the impression that, you know, Britain is a nice liberal country, as opposed to these nasty autocratic Habsburgs. But the other point, I recall Professor Tony Kushner in this seminar series talking about his family history. And the family myth was that they were refugees from the pogroms in Russia. They came from the Lithuanian area. He's investigated it, and they left before there were any pogroms in Lithuania. So therefore, in his view, were probably economic migrants. So sometimes this refugee tag is almost a matter of pride.
Yeah, that's so interesting. And I think that kind of the story that family tells each other about how they get here and where it fits is really interesting. And I wonder how far that drove it, you know, has been such a pioneer in this field of refugee history, whether that was the thing that was really driving his research to then find out it wasn't the case.
Hello. Yeah, well, in the 80s, I was working in the East London borough of Newham, and there was a major multicultural effort with regard to language, and this was intended to empower settling migrants, but among them particularly the wives and mothers who in the sort of patriarchal culture were not encouraged by their spouses to learn English, and so this was an empowerment rather than an othering, as it were, or an implied temporary. And I think it's important to realise that was so in order to integrate an entire family rather than just the head of the family, if they were non-English speaking originally.
Oh yeah, of course. Yeah. So Paul was talking about his experience working for Newham Council in the 80s, which is actually where I've come from today. We're based in the new UCL East campuses in Stratford, but how the use of multiple languages there was to reach particularly women in families who might not otherwise have the opportunity to get access to those resources. So it's seen as an empowering tool rather than an othering one. And I think, you know, I agree with that, Paul. I don't think I think that kind of production of multiple languages is really helpful in thinking about, the sort of structures of patriarchy, right, that persist in thinking about it too. And certainly the kind of the limitation on other forms of resources that often councils were given to do this work, it might be easier to translate and print things than to run English classes, which is really resource heavy.
Just had something really quick to say on that.
We need to finish doing that.
Oh, I'll be really quick because I wrote English programs for refugees, so I had an insight into this.
The thing that we always grappled with designing resources is we don't want to force them to learn English, but if they don't, things are much more difficult for them.
Yeah.
So it's realizing that we're not trying to impose a dominant identity or dominant, vision of them, but we are trying to help for a very practical everyday thing. So we always try to meet somewhere between absolutely speak your own languages and bring your own cultures with you, but also if you don't have those skills, then it becomes very difficult, particularly it being a gendered thing as well.
Yeah.
That people can become very isolated and kind of insular. So yeah, I think that there's the practicalities as well as the kind of theoretical angle.
Yeah, well, that's part of the hostility of the environment is the level of bureaucracy you have to negotiate. So if you haven't got any language, any English language, that becomes almost impossible. Sorry, Chris, I know we're over time.
Okay, I think it's probably time to finish. To thank Anna and my three colleagues from the Modern History Research Centre for fascinating talk and contributions. It's generated a fascinating conversation. So thank you.
Just to tell to everybody to subscribe to the Modern History Research Centre for the tickets cost £6 each visit, but for £25 you can access all events for free, and you will receive emails and be updated, and you can even suggest topics that we could be discussing in our events. So it's just £25 annually. Email us at mhrc@winchester.ac.uk. You might have received already the email address with the response to your bookings. So that's it. No more.
Thanks very
Thank you very much.
Please come to the next talk.
Yes.